Welcome to the Spirit of Truth video podcast. Joining us today is a special guest, my friend Brigitte Mars. She's an author of 14 herbal medicine books, and she's an herbal master here in our local Boulder community. We're very lucky and privileged to have her join us today, so stick around, it's going to be awesome. Welcome back to the Spirit of Truth video podcast. So I'm very happy to join my friend from the local Boulder Urantia community, Miss Brigitte Mars. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Derek. Blessings.
Yeah, so I've been a fan of yours in the distance, in quiet. You know, I'm such a believer in natural medicine. And as I've observed you teaching quite well over the past, I'd say 2 years that I've been here in Boulder, I've been blown away and I'm really impressed, and I'm so thankful that you're here. And I was kind of hoping that you could just kind of bless us with the inspiration of the way that you see health and see life, and just give us a perspective through your perspective, please.
Well, I always feel that, illness often happens for a reason. It could be coming from our emotional or mental outlook. Certainly, there's a lot of hints in the Urantia book about how Adam and Eve ate. They were raw foodists, how the prince's staff ate. And I really do believe that it is God's desire for us to be healthy. And the Urantia book also says that herbs are a bona fide, true way of healing. And when Jesus was a youth, the things he studied were the wildflowers and the stars. So for me, that was a great confirmation that, keep studying those plants. And, in the early 70s, I had a vegetarian restaurant in Miami, and we sold these teas called Celestial Seasonings, Red Zinger Tea. And I served it at my restaurant, and they had these really cool little tags on them. And I remember, I didn't know anybody else who read the Urantia book, but when I saw those teas, I said, I bet they read the Urantia book. And so that was actually one of my inspirations for moving to Boulder, that maybe I could find some other Urantia book readers.
So, yeah, we had the owner of Celestial Seasons over here, Mo Siegel. And so how long did it take for you to just get into the scene over here?
Well, as soon as I moved here, I started attending Boulder College of Massage in the 1977, and I found a Urantia study group. And that was great. I was so delighted. We had study group every week. My children were young, and these are still people that I'm very connected with and see often.
Yeah, that's cool. So I feel like maybe being here in Boulder has a little bit of a vibe. You live directly in Boulder, and I feel like you kind of personify a little bit of the personal vibe that is here. It's a little bit natural, a little bit religious, spiritual, a lot of holistic, and a lot of, I would say, herbal health. So was this something that was always in your life, or did it come on later on when your spiritual life took on more? Or can you kind of maybe take us through the path of what brought you into this current state?
Well, even as a very young child, I had a French-Canadian grandmother, and her way was to use herbal medicine, apple cider vinegar and honey, cabbage, plantain tea. All my cousins and I walked around with little medicine bags of garlic, and I did not like getting shots. Okay. I found that to be a great violation. I wanted the remedies that grand-mère used. And so even by the time I was a teenager, I was using a lot of folk remedies on my friends. And I realized that even though I was a kid, these were remedies that had been time-tested by millions of people for thousands of years. And there was also something very equalizing about it, that this is medicine that everyone can afford. This is medicine that's available in all parts of the world. You don't need to have super high technology to, use things like cabbage or garlic or vinegar or lemon juice. Right. It's really medicine for the people. And I certainly believe that our Creator would want everyone to have access. And, the Bible even says, behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed, which is upon the face of the earth. So to me, use the herbs and heal the people.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing to say that there's already enough here for us to heal ourselves with what God and nature has graced us with.
It really felt connected. And, very often what pharmaceutical companies have tried to do is to refine or extract a certain constituent from a plant, because you can't patent a plant. So they're going to look for what is the supposed active ingredient. But very often when you remove something from nature, you often get side effects. A great example is coca leaves, which are used by the people of South America, are considered non-addicting, energizing, helping to curb hunger, high in vitamins and minerals. But when you turn that into a drug by isolating the alkaloid cocaine, now you've got a problem. And it does cause addiction and mineral depletion and all kinds of health issues.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like addiction is something that we're just struggling systemically with in the society. And I wonder if maybe you, as an herbologist master, has seen what it is that when you kind of manipulate natural organic products into a mutated type of thing, what is it that starts messing with our dopamine levels and starts getting us completely addicted to these things?
Well, I actually have written a book called Addiction Free Naturally, because I think that even though people might have good intentions and take their herbs, take their vitamins, eat healthy, do yoga, if they're addicted to something, that could still be undermining their health. But I do feel that there's some core things at the roots of addiction. One is low blood sugar. I think that most addictive substances are trying to elevate or change our blood sugar. A cup of coffee, a drink of beer, or whatever. I also think that people with substance abuse issues often are poor oxygen metabolizers. So things like deep breathing can be very helpful.
Interesting.
But I also think that people are looking for a spiritual epiphany. They're looking for their tribe. They're looking to connect. And very often we move into addictive patterns because we want to, hang with the cool people, or be part of this gang or whatever. But I do think that really what fills our souls is some sort of spiritual epiphany to feel that we're connected to divinity.
Yeah.
And I also think the age-old tradition of people doing crafts with their hands. I think we have generations now where people haven't learned how to whittle or sketch or play an instrument or, knit or crochet. And so we have people, using all kinds of things to cope with boredom, loneliness, anxiety. And I think that, doing crafts with our hands would help us to have a lot less dementia in our elderly population, because knit one, purl two is actually really good for that hand-brain connection.
Oh, yeah. I'll have to catch up on my crocheting abilities. But, I think like you say, busying your hands.
The old timers used to say, idle fingers are the devil's playground. And so,
Right.
now we've got change the remote or play video games, but you have nothing really to show for your time afterwards.
I agree.
So,
I agree.
It could be anything, and, I think really men and women should both learn to do something with their hands. In our ancestors' times, the men were making cradle boards and whittling knife handles, and the women were making socks and tablecloths. And it's a nice way to commune together rather than, let's just party.
Right. As well as working in the field, gardening together.
Yes.
That's a wonderful thing to just kind of have an intimate experience with nature also. Well, I'm glad that you touched on some of the spiritual aspects that can lead to addiction, because it's something that I reflect on a lot. I grew up in Chicago and in not all of the best neighborhoods and stuff. And I was living in some areas that were filled with a lot of addicted people, and I could see them suffering. And I'm glad that you touched on, we all have our little bit of our addictions. And I wonder what, in your mind, how much of that is a choice of getting past addictions, and how much is it that we're unaware of things that are keeping us addicted? Does that make sense?
Well, we also know that there's a genetic component to addiction. Not only could there be that, but we also tend to emulate those that are around us that we admire. So when we see the elders in our community, they get to do that. I can't wait till I'm old enough so that I can, buy cigarettes or beer or, heroin or whatever it is, unfortunately.
Right.
But I also think that we don't want to use that as a cop-out. It's very possible that we can take charge of our health by eating healthier than those that have fallen by the wayside with addiction. So, rather than thinking that there's nothing we can do about it, we can overcome a lot of poor genetics with healthy eating and do our best, rather than just thinking that there's no choice, that we're going to have a heart attack just because Uncle Bobby did too.
Oh, I like that. It's almost this like epigenetics idea that you can actually change your chemistry by your choices and what you're putting into your system, essentially.
Somewhat. And, I find that there's so many people that do have trauma. So often people will use an addiction to cover up the pain that they have from trauma. And so, there's a lot of core issues. There's a lot of problems on our planet. And I feel that all we can do is focus on, what can we do to make a positive difference?
So let's talk about what you do to make a positive difference, because it is a lot. Let's talk about maybe some of your publications and some of your ideas. I mean, you have 14 books. That's a lot. That's a ton. So congratulations. I'm totally impressed by that much work. So something is driving you heavily to do this.
Well, really, to make a positive difference. And I have written a number of books, titles like The Sexual Herbal, Addiction Free Naturally, The Desktop Guide to Herbal Medicine, The Country Almanac of Home Remedies, which is really about the remedies that our four ancestors have used. So I'm also working on like a 60s memoir. And
what's that about?
It's called Wildflower Child, A Tale of Sex, Psychedelics, and Natural Foods, actually. Because I was very much a part of that whole counterculture movement of anti-Vietnam War activist. I lived in a teepee for 2.5 years, gave birth in a teepee to my daughter Rainbow. My kids are named Rainbow and Sunflower. But I also think that we need a feminine voice for those times. People often say, if you can remember the 60s, you weren't really there. But I can remember, because I was a young mother and I was taking notes, and I had to be able to get up for my kids in the morning. And I ate for 2.5 years nothing but wild edible plants in the Ozarks. So, I was always partaking in this experiment and living. And it was a great adventure. But I also think that there's a lot of healing and there's a lot of techniques that we can learn from that. And, I sometimes like to joke, the hippies were right all along, because 50 years ago, 60 years ago, we were talking and doing alternative energy, organic gardening, natural childbirth, herbal medicine, organic food, yoga, meditation, and really saying that herbal medicine, including cannabis, are all part of our birthright. And so that's never shifted for me. Yeah. And the story also is going to include a little bit, I have a chapter in there called Hippie Chick Seeks Revelation, about my finding the Urantia book.
Yeah, tell us.
Well, I know that there's a lot of different approaches to it, how people found the Urantia book. But I came to it from a counterculture perspective. And I remember I had this friend named Babaru, and every time we would have a smoke, he would pull out this big blue book. And I'd say, Babaru, I do not need to read this book. It's a lot of words. I've done the big dose. And one day we were just talking, and I said something about, I wonder what happened to the dinosaurs. And he said, sister, anything you want to read is in this book. And so I started reading the Urantia book, usually by lantern, kerosene lantern in the teepee. And I started out very cautious, thinking how do I know? I wouldn't have joined the Lucifer Rebellion, had I been on the planet at the time. And I don't know about all this Jesus stuff. I had a Catholic mother and a Jewish father. But by the time I got to the Jesus Papers, I was definitely ready, and it was a much better story than what I had read. But I'd have to say that it was the history of Urantia that really got me. I think the night I read The First Human Family, and then, later on, the Adam and Eve Papers, I really related to that.
Yeah, it sounds like especially Eve of some sort. I've always blown away and talking with my mother about how Eve had the awareness of mixing cereals and nuts to make milks for her children, the juices and stuff like that. That's something that I've really tried to incorporate in my life, at least the juicing process, And so I just kind of want to ask you a little bit about maybe some of the things that you've been inspired from the Garden of Eden, or Adamic culinary abilities and whatnot, you might say, their nutrition abilities. What have you adopted into your life?
Well, I wrote a book called Rawsome, and I remember years ago, I have a daughter, Rainbow, who's an actress, and she went to Hollywood and made a movie with Woody Harrelson, and called and said, "Mom, I've gone raw." And I remember thinking, oh my God, she has an eating disorder. I must go save her. And I went to go save her, and I realized that a lot of her friends, they were very interested in the Essenes, and they were reading the Essene Gospel of Peace. And there was evidence that the Essenes were sprouting their grain and then baking their breads on the hot rocks of the desert.
Wow.
And I thought, that's kind of interesting. And then I realized, like, all her friends are really, really healthy, and that a lot of even the natural foods movement, organic macaroni and cheese in a box is still a real processed food. Right. It might be organic, it might be vegan or gluten-free, but it's still kind of processed. So I decided that I was going to try eating raw foods for a year, and it ended up being for 10 years. But there's a line in the Urantia book that Adam and Eve were able to simply look at the animals and know what their nature is. And they could also see things that were not seen with the naked eye. And in herbal medicine, there's this beautiful philosophy called the doctrine of signatures, la signatura, which has the word sign of nature in it. And there's this, it sounds very folkloric, and I didn't talk about it for many years, but it's really coming to light that the plants tell us what they're good for by the way they look and by the way they grow. You might even say that an imprint of the divine is on everything. So that, beets really do build your blood. Kidney beans really strengthen the kidneys. Cauliflower is great for the brain. Blueberries are good for our eyes. Seaweed for our hair. And the more that I've studied, botany and homeopathy and herbal medicine, I really do think, the animals know usually what they can eat, and that, Adam and Eve, when they came to this plant, the Garden of Eden was resplendent with plants. The tree of life had been planted there, and when they were told they needed to leave the garden, they were advised to get whatever roots, bulbs, and seeds you can collect. You cannot bring the core of the tree of life with you. But it was very important what plants. And I know that we are still partaking of the ancestors, perhaps of many of these plants today.
Yeah, amen, amen. A lot of the wheats and grains and cereals came in that migration, I believe, over to the middle of Mesopotamia at the Second Garden. So as you talk about the core of the tree of life, I know that you've given a few presentations on some of your theories and perspectives of the tree of life and where it stands now and brought into herbal medication and whatnot. Would you mind maybe telling us a little bit about that?
Well, when I heard about a plant whose leaves shall be for the healing of the nations, and the Urantia book says that the tree of life was an actual tree that was brought here by the prince's staff that grew in, the first civilization where the prince's staff were located, Dalmatia, and that the tree of life grows throughout the universe. And if and the tree of life was supposed to give the prince's staff immortality, but it also makes sense that it was probably going to be a plant that was going to help them to civilize the 6 Sangic races. And I study all plants, and I realize that perhaps we don't have the original tree of life. But when I think of a plant, what plant would have been more useful to bring to planet Earth than a plant that could make food, fiber, fuel, fabric? And I do think of cannabis. It grows as tall as a tree in one season. I do not think we should be cutting down old growth forests to make the Sunday Times when we have a plant that could regenerate in 4 months. We we have so many planetary problems right now. It's also interesting that cannabis actually has male and female plants.
Right.
That they grow on different plants usually. And that's interesting. And there's a few plants that do that in the plant queendom or kingdom. It's also interesting that there's only one other relative of cannabis on the planet, and that is hops, which has long, governed the airwaves and the media and advertising. And so, here's a plant that has, certainly could have helped to civilize humanity because it just has so many uses. There's a story that, Henry Ford in 1941 built a car that the body was made out of hemp, and it was fueled with hemp seed oil. And there's a very famous picture of him with a sledgehammer trying to smash the car, and it turns out that it was several times stronger than steel. Oh, wow. But look at how much steel is being taken out of the earth and creating toxic fumes and taking forever to decompose. And one of the most pesticided plants on our planet right now, because it's not considered a food crop, is cotton. Oh. And because it's not a food crop, there's no restrictions on the amount of pesticides that can be used. And we also know that cotton was one of the incentives to bring slaves here from Africa to, grow this labor-intensive crop, that and sugarcane and tobacco. So we know that cannabis can grow easily and with fraction of the amount of chemicals give off its fibers and make a very durable fiber. And paper.
Doesn't cannabis also have properties that can fight off other chemicals like radiation and stuff like that?
Yes, and there's a lot of research right now. If you're following Facebook or the media, you're hearing that we actually have an endocannabinoid system in our bodies.
Right.
We actually are designed to evolve with this plant. And anyone who's been following this, knows that cannabis competes with a lot of big industries, like the oil and gas companies and the food industry.
Pharmaceuticals.
Hemp seed is the second highest source of vegetable protein next to soybeans. Oh. But yet soybeans are a common GMO food, and they're very easy to digest. A lot of people decide they want to, eat more vegan or eat more vegetarian, and then they end up eating soy, and it doesn't always work that well for them. So, there's a local magazine here called Sensi Magazine, and I met with the editor of the magazine, and we were talking about cannabis, and first thing he said is, I believe it is exoplanetary. And I said, you believe that it maybe came from another planet? And he said, absolutely. There's no other plant that does so many things. And believe me, I have dedicated my life to the studies of plants. I can tell you backwards and forwards the Latin names and family names of thousands of plants. Wow. But this plant is truly unique. And so I've been presenting a PowerPoint, which I call Out on a Limb. Cannabis is the tree of life.
Okay.
And so again, Adam and Eve could not bring the core of the tree of life with them when they left the first garden. But cannabis is one of the easiest plants to clone. And if you were to tell me I couldn't bring the core of that peach tree in my yard with me, I would find a way to bring something, either the seeds or some branches or some root cuttings.
Or couldn't you also maybe, if you were that advanced, that maybe you could make some kind of hybrid of it or something, like some derivative of the tree or something, and get a seed of it somehow?
Possibly. But I do know that they could not bring the core of the tree of life with them. So right. It's very possible that what we have is a very, inferior version of the original plant.
Okay.
All right. But, the leaves shall be for the healing of the nations. And, I feel strongly that, in many traditions, when people want to have a peacemaking effort, they sit in a circle and they pray and they offer the smoke to the four directions and they pass it around, and they often can work through their differences. Yeah. So we know that, Makaventa Melchizedek did not have access to the tree of life. But there's a very interesting part in the Old Testament that they talk a lot about the holy anointing oil. And the holy anointing oil was made from olive oil, cinnamon, myrrh, and cannabosum. Cannabosum.
Yeah, sounds like cannabis to me.
Yeah. However, in a Greek translation of the Old Testament in the 3rd century BC, the Septuagint, they translated cannabosum to be Acorus calamus. Acorus calamus is not a very healing plant. It's not something most people are going to have in their herbal first aid kits or anything. So it's very unlikely that calamus would have been used to anoint the sick or anoint sacred things in the temple. But the Bible also talks about caneh, Kaneh, being a fiber plant, that shrouds are made of caneh. And so one of the oldest mummies found on the face of the earth was a red-headed mummy found in China, buried in a hemp shroud.
I just read about that in the Tarim Basin, those Tarim mummies, and he was red-headed, blue-eyed, light-skinned priest of some sort who had a stash of weed essentially on him.
Stash of weed because, what could have been more useful? So,
And just so we know that this is like 9,000 years ago that this body is from, or wherever this mummy that they did find. So that's a long time ago.
So cannabis sativa, the word sativa means with a long history of cultivation. And Carl Sagan, you all know him from Cosmos, he believed that cannabis is the oldest cultivated plant on the face of the earth. So that's interesting. Now, Jesus' first miracle was performed in Cana.
Right.
He turned water into wine.
Right.
I wonder what they grew in Cana.
Yeah, the Canaanites.
It's very possible that, Jesus' robes was made out of hemp, his sandals. We know that the first Bibles printed on the Gutenberg press were printed on hemp paper.
Well, it's also possible that the following of Cain himself, his guidance from the second garden, from Eve, and then bringing peace among the Adamites and the Nodites, and then having the land of Canaan.
Yes, I definitely love that whole track. So I wonder if when he went to his mother Eve and was so grieved that he had killed his brother, and he was forgiven and given a thought adjuster, it would have been very useful to give him some hemp seeds. And perhaps there is a connection between Cain and the Canaanites. And they also refer to them as the purple people. And our friend Beis Sarmast often surmised that, Cain might also be a manifestation of Chiron, the Sagittarius, the half human, half beast.
Right.
Because Chiron is said to have been learned about herbs from Diana, the mother goddess, which might be another name for Eve. Yeah. So, all of that. We could go into a whole thing about that.
Plus what you were just talking about having this ceremonial peace pipe, right? And I'm not just like speculating like, sweet, Cain rolled joints with the Nodites and they just chilled out and listened to Pink Floyd or whatever. I'm not saying that. But still, there is a communal process of that. And maybe there was foresight by Eve of saying, I'm going to stack the deck in your favor when you go out there. Take these seeds with you. You're going to bring abundance to where you go. Something like that.
And, in the Urantia book, later on, and in the Bible, the apostles used the holy anointing oil to heal the sick. And it turns out that we have a lot of these endocannabinoid receptor sites on our skin. Oh, okay. So certainly applying it to the skin. The word Christ means the anointed one.
Right, in Greek.
And so we certainly talk about, baptism, but so many people are getting relief from their ailments just by rubbing, even if it doesn't have THC in it, but using this plant that has so many compounds that we've just begin to study again.
Right.
And so that's really amazing. And that's, just some of the aspects from, Christianity and the Bible. But the Urantia book does say that Jesus, he didn't want to comment on the holy anointing oil because we know that the women and men apostles used it for healing. And they asked him, what do you think about it? And he reserved to comment. Maybe he knew how controversial this plant was going to be. But if we journey on to Hinduism.
Yeah, please.
In the Hindu culture, Lord Shiva, who's part of the Trinity in Hinduism, along with Vishnu and Brahma, Lord Shiva used to like to go and cavort with the maidens, and his consort Parvati didn't like that so much. So she created a plant, and when he came home, they experienced marital bliss. And so Shiva is said to be the Lord of Ganja, another folk word for cannabis, but the Ganges River comes out of his top knot, and you often see a cannabis leaf at his top knot. And when the sadhus, those that are devoted to Shiva, when they pray, they hold the chilam up to their third eye, and they say, Bom Shiva Shankar Hari Hari Ganja. Now, I'm certainly not thinking that cannabis is more important than Jesus or God. I'm not. I mean, or the Urantia Book for that matter. But as an herbalist, I want to know more about how plants can help us on this planet. And when I hear about a plant that can do all of these things. So Buddha is said to have eaten 1 hemp seed a day. And in Buddhism, there is they have some of their deities, and one of them is the hemp maiden, Magu, and she heals with medicinal plants. The Shinto religion, all of their ceremonial garb, the ropes, their garments, the robes that they wear are all made out of hemp. And the Hindu religion in the Vedas, they talk about some psychoactive beverage called soma. And people for years have thought, what is soma? Is it Peganum harmala? Is it ephedra? Is it psilocybin? Is it Amanita muscaria? We'll probably argue about it till the end of time. But one researcher whose work I appreciate, Chris Bennett, really thinks that it could be cannabis, and probably a combination of plants. Okay. So it's interesting that there's threads of this in many, many world religions, but the idea that perhaps cannabism got mistranslated, because very often translators are not herbalists or botanists. We'll just give it another name. But when we look at right now that our planet is in peril, there are environmental crises breathing down our neck in every aspect, and we're perhaps the lucky ones that are still living in air clean enough to breathe, because some parts of the world, people have to go into little oxygen things and breathe oxygen. It's getting pretty dire. So I'm really hopeful that we can use this plant in a good way. And, until recently, I still see that the plant was very persecuted. And even though it's been legal in Colorado for a few years, having to grow it indoors with electric lights and fluoridated water is still not an environmental asset. So I'm glad that more and more states are realizing that this is a plant that can help save small farms, that this is something that we could be doing with minimal amounts of pesticides and fungicides when it's grown outdoors. Yeah. But, I also want to mention another dark chapter in history, and that is that, there's one line in the Bible that thou shall not suffer a poisoner to live, or thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And I think that women were very demonized because of their temptating qualities of beauty and, sexuality and all that. And there was a very dark period in history between the 1400s and the 1700s where witches were executed. And very often these witches, so-called witches, were herbalists and midwives that had plant knowledge. There was also this philosophy in the Bible that, and the Urantia Book also touches on this, that women would suffer in childbirth, after the mutations of the species, and that we didn't get the full Adamic uplift that we would have gotten. Right. And, Leota died in childbirth, and Eve kindly took that child to her breast and raised her. What a noble thing. But the idea that a lot of this herbal knowledge was persecuted because the church did not like the idea that herbalists knew about contraceptive plants. That's still very controversial. That ergot, which later became LSD, lysergic acid, was used in midwifery to bring on labor and to stop a woman from hemorrhaging. So ergot had very medicinal properties as well. And not to mention all the other plants, things that were used in love potions, because it was believed that healing the sick should only be done through your doing penance and giving alms to the church and, repenting for your sins and so forth. So, here we have a plant that really can help to give comfort and healing, and we're seeing this every day. And just this morning, I was reading about how, Jesus would heal the sick, and it was really their faith that healed them. So I certainly don't think, we need anything, but yet we are a culture that uses food on this planet, and that we do drink teas, and why not use something medicinal? And this is not to say that I think everyone needs to be potheads. I certainly, I want to stand by that. But I also want to say that if there is a plant that could solve so many of our environmental problems and bring about health to the people so they don't have to be taking these pharmaceutical and very often addicting drugs that are made from petrochemicals and that have, pages of side effects, I think we should wake up to that. And I'm going to stand up for it as long as I live.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that. And then I wonder, how do you feel about that when society starts to accept these more natural routes, but then the big corporations come and say, no, we're going to sell it with our little recipe with it. You know what I mean? It's like we're getting a degraded version of the purity of it too.
Well, that's why we always want to do our best to support organic. I feel strongly that we vote with our dollars. And we do know that has been even the tendency in the natural foods industry. A lot of small mom and pop stores got replaced by, corporate giants that are owned by bigger corporate giants. And I don't think it has to be us and them. I'm really hoping that we can, tame the dragon. And I do think that maybe big business messed a lot of things up, but I'm also hoping that big business can make things right. I know, many years ago, a large paper company hired me to brainstorm the future of paper. And this was maybe 30 years ago. And I was saying hemp paper towels, hemp napkins, hemp disposable diapers. And now, we're starting to see that become more available. Of course, I was weird back then, and maybe I'm weird now, but I'd like to think that the Urantia book has opened my consciousness and certainly elevated my IQ to thinking outside the box.
Yeah. Well, I can say that, from my experience, before I came to the Urantia book, I came to more of a Taoist practice, but more of a Kundalini meditation practice, if that makes sense, a chakra type of awareness in my meditation and attuning to the divine. And I just kind of want to, I was really reflecting on this lately about that chakra tuning, Kundalini awareness, however you want to call it, how I've just been kind of vibing on the fact that it's really this way of kind of encircling one into the Holy Spirit. Yeah. And the correlation between the adjutant mind spirits and the chakra system. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. And I love when we read in study group and you can look at the 7 adjutant mind spirits and see how they relate to the chakras. And the chakras relate to the colors and they relate to the elements. And I actually do program with Bethy Lovelight called a Chakra Activation and Buddha Bomb. We're doing it in Portland next weekend.
Cool.
So Chakra Activation, where we use sound, flavor, aroma, and color to activate the chakras, and each one represents another state of attainment.
Okay.
So, we could say like red is about survival and passion, and that orange is more about, caring about another person, and that yellow is our material comfort zone. And then we move into the heart center about love and compassion and forgiveness. And then blue is speaking our truth. And then this is our intelligence and our meditation and reflection. And then this is connecting to the divine. So ideally, we want all our chakras to be activated. And, sometimes I feel a little baffled when I go to some Urantia potlucks and I see wow, Jello salad with marshmallow, like we should be taking care of all of our chakras, like, and that eating healthfully, if you want to feel good so we can do God's work, for God's sake, feel good. But if you're not going to get it with, buying into the sugar trap and the,
Yeah. Well, I find myself constantly talking with my guests about this, is the level of actualization a Urantia Book reader takes on from when you're a book owner, book reader, to where you're walking your talk, living encircuited in the Holy Spirit, where you're trying to maximize, or as I say, stack the deck in your favor, to be able to execute the most amount of service for the most amount of good, for the most amount of people, for the most amount of time. Right?
You need energy to do that.
Yeah.
And if something's out of balance, if you're like all, messed up in here, it's hard to really be doing your very best. But, again, people are going to do what they want to do, and I support that, and I'm here to help if I can.
Yeah. So then what do you do when you find, maybe you're have a client or patient, whatever, and you're talking with them and you realize that their nutrition and their lifestyle is just, wow, this is not good. But to then approach that in a way that is loving and guiding and not judgmental and not saying, okay, everything you're doing is wrong, man. Throw it out the window. It's like, where do you start with someone?
Well, usually if people come to see me, they're ready to make a difference because they've tried a lot of other things. So I'm going to take a look at what's going to work best for their lifestyle. I certainly don't expect everyone is going to want to be vegetarian or vegan or raw foodist or anything. So I want to help people do it as painlessly with some steps in the right direction. And I think we always want to praise the progress and praise the good. But a real simple thing is to eat all the colors of the rainbow. The American diet has become, rather beige. But when we, think about, eating lots of colorful fresh fruits and vegetables, I don't think there's a program on the planet that would think that wasn't a good idea. And that doesn't mean, colored
fruit punch and stuff.
Yeah, no, we're talking, the colors that we're really blessed with, which are, designed to attract us. So that's a really simple thing we can do. And natural medicine isn't for everybody. I think most people are probably going to just listen to their doctors, and they should do that because natural medicine takes a commitment to doing things a little different. I actually heard someone at Urantia study group say, well, my doctor's going to get my blood pressure down for me. And I said, well, don't you think you should get it down? But there's this attitude that the doctors are going to fix it. And we certainly can have doctors help us, but we need to help them too. Just like, God can help us, but we want to help God achieve those destinies on our planet as well.
Well, you bring up a concept that I've been kind of reflecting on a lot lately, and that is this notion of, when we're in a state of dis-ease, whether it's emotional, physical, spiritual, whatever it is, as you just touched on, it's like we need this voice of authority to say you're going to be okay, and then we accept that we're going to be okay. And usually we're riddled with guilt, usually, that it's hard to say, okay, I'm loved, let me open up and let the authority of all authorities heal me, and as you pointed out, if you don't have that deep spiritual relationship with divinity, then you can tend to look for titles in society, titles of men. The doctor said I will be okay because I did this, and call him in the morning. And so how much have you found in your practice just the shift when one just believes, or one is kind of, I would say, receives? Because I feel that there's a real challenge in our society of how to genuinely receive that love, that healing stuff, so that we can believe that we're loved. Mm-hmm.
Well, there's so many ways that people take that in or don't take that in. But I just really hold on to that. I'm certainly not trying to change everybody. There's enough people that are ready for change. But I also think that are going to be more capable if we can be on this earth and feel good and that the body does matter. It is our vehicle for our time, our sojourn here. And again, we don't need to be overly attached to it because we're all going to leave this planet and continue our journey through the mansion worlds. And that's great. But, let's do what we can and feel good about it while we're here.
Yeah.
And, I also feel strongly that we vote with our dollars. So when we choose to support the companies that are doing good things for the planet and the organic foods movement, or even if it's, with animal foods, doing the best that they can with humane treatment of animals and all of that. So, and I don't think we all have to be uniform. I love that the Urantia book says we can have spiritual unity without spiritual uniformity.
And what does that mean to you?
Well, it means that we might have different priorities and we may go about it in different ways. And I also love that the Urantia book, as I paraphrase, that we should look for the similarities in one another rather than get hung up on the differences. So, I'm just here one person, but I feel like my prayer is to be of service, to be of service to help reconnect people and the realm of the plant world, which I believe are a gift of our Creator. And I don't know why we don't learn these important things in school. It's said that the average American recognizes over 1,000 logos and the products they're associated with, and yet less than 5 plants in their area. And if they recognize one plant and it's a dandelion, they might think they need to go buy some chemical to kill that.
Some Roundup.
And yet dandelions are the first food for the bees in the springtime. They aerate the soil. The flowers are high in lutein. So I'm a champion for all the herbs, including the weeds, which are usually the ancestors of our vegetables.
I appreciate that fight. And, it also seems that there's a balance, a tricky balance in our current society too. I appreciate that you're well balanced between the plant life, the spiritual life, personal human life of communication and stuff like that. And I feel that maybe in younger crowds or whatnot, it's kind of like if you take on this plant life, that is your spirituality, and that you're spiritual because you burn sage. You know what I mean? And that's kind of like the compartment that you get stuck in, and you haven't taken it into the real spirit communications and relationship with the divine personality. Do you ever find that you've come across ways of either using nature as a portal or an entrance into deeper religious understandings? Or have you ever come across challenges where you kind of just say, okay, I'm this herbalist, yogi, guru, and then you forget about your relationship with divinity in a personal, visceral way?
Well, it's wonderful that we live in a place where the nature is so beautiful, but we want to remember how all of this was created. So it's not about worshiping nature. It's about, honoring nature and protecting nature. But when it comes to worship, it's created by one much greater than our perception here on this earth. But, you mentioned burning sage, and the word perfume means to purify through smoke. So a really early form of worship was to burn things like frankincense, myrrh, sage, artemisia, cinnamon, as a way of sending your prayers heavenward. So it was also done with intention. It wasn't just that the sage was magical. It was a way of perhaps the gods will see our prayers or hear our prayers as the smoke rises. But we also know that many of those plants, frankincense and myrrh included, are very, very antimicrobial. And so by burning them in the temple or sweat lodge or synagogue or church or wherever was actually going to help prevent the spread of infection. So it was also very practical. And I love, reading that Jesus was a caravan leader for a period of time. And, what did the caravans transport? Very often it was herbs and spices and precious gemstones and fabrics, but definitely herbs and spices.
Yeah. I didn't really realize how a lot of these things that we take on, maybe we take for granted, but we don't realize the practical purposes that they originally had for everyone, and that maybe when an Adam and Eve start taking on practices and the average evolutionary mortals are just observing it and watching it, and then they repeat it. Maybe they don't know why they're repeating it, but it still has beneficial properties for us, you know, as you said with the incense and things like that. So I would like to talk to you a little bit about when you're working with people, and I know that the Urantia Book's been a big part of your life. Do you ever find yourself introducing the book itself to your patients and clients? And
I do a lot. I teach herbal medicine at Naropa University.
Cool.
And one of the first classes I do is the history of herbal medicine. Okay. And I talk about, because there's a lot in there about the history that the earliest plant life was the bacteria that grew on the rocks. I have a slide about that. I talk about the tree of life. I talk about... Yeah, I do. And I have a slide that shows a picture of the Urantia Book. And a lot of them tell me they get the book, and I tell them you can get it online as a phone app. And, you know, in my private practice, I often have people that are spiritually seeking.
Right.
You know, and maybe they've lost someone. And I find that there's such hope in the Urantia Book about life after death and that we see our loved ones again. So, you know, I might be an odd one. I may be the hippie faction of the Urantia movement. I have no problem with that. But I also think that I have the opportunity to connect with a lot of young people and a lot of seekers, and maybe people who aren't going to find it because, you know, Jesus might not be the go-to thing that gets them in the book. Maybe they'll be ready for that later, but they're interested in history and, you know, life on other worlds. Yeah. And I mean, there's so much right now. I'm a subscriber to Gaia TV, and, you know, there's all these shows about ancient civilizations. Who were they? Why were they here? Where did they go?
Don't you just get frustrated?
What was that all about? And, you know, I love to say, you know, a lot of those answers to the questions are in the Urantia Book. Yes, there were extraterrestrials here. And if you want to know why and how and what went wrong, I mean, it seems to me that the whole Star Wars scenario is really based on something that really happened, a war in the heavens.
Yeah, Lucifer rebellion type of scenario. Yeah, I always find myself, whenever I'm doing outreach at booths, it's like, when the young people show up, I'd say like 40 and below young people. The key, what I usually found is it's that ancient aliens thing. And I'm okay with it because, like you, I like part 3 of the Urantia Book, and it's like actually brought a lot of peace into my life because I know where the sources of a lot of things, the origin, history, and destiny of a lot of things come from, that a lot of people will probably be confused by. So being privileged with that information, when a searching young person comes up to the booth and you say, oh yeah, that means this, 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 and they've never even heard that before. You know, they're like, whoa, there's something of value here because something that's currently trending in society, I just learned privileged information on. So it's almost like this carrot that you dangle in front of them, not in a coercive way because you're actually feeding their intellect, but then it's like this trail opens up, this path opens up for them.
Well, when my grandson, Solwyn, was 6, he was very infatuated with Star Wars, and he said, I want to be a Jedi, Grandmère. And I said, you know, we have this book written by ETs here on the planet. And so he's been reading the Urantia Book since he was 6. Whoa. And, you know, God bless Jennifer Siegel, who's had a children's study group for the past few years, because him and his best friend, Peter, and my granddaughter now, and another friend, they all read the Urantia Book, and they're just like preteens and teenagers.
Wow. Now, just for I'm on one of those graphic video people, and I'm always looking for other ways to attempt to uplift the quality of thinking that people can just kind of digest and take into their life. Have you noticed anything of the youth in your family or your friends of maybe have you come up with methods that maybe might be needed into the future or what they're gravitating towards or something that can really help them in their development? Well,
you know, I do find it challenging for a lot of the young people that I talk to that the father, son thing seems to be putting off, even though I understand, and as readers, we understand that, hey, the Urantia book also talks about that God is our father and the universe is our mother, and that the, creative mother spirit and the local universe mother spirit, and that Jesus had a core of women apostles. So I definitely feel like that's something that is maybe going to, make people a little more open. And I have, with some people, change the language when I'm reading it. So we say father and mother, Adam and Eve, to just be a little more inclusive. And I realized that when the Urantia book was written, that was the language of the time. But you asked, it's not that it's my place to change the Urantia book. I, love it and believe in it. But I'm also thinking about, what is really, because I really do think that this is what a lot of people are looking for. And I want it to work. And that might not be the carrot. I think a lot of people want to know about life after death.
Yeah.
That's an amazing, amazing part of the book. And it gives people such hope.
Yeah, I feel like the challenge for me, at least, is finding ways of packaging messages that people can digest in smaller bites nowadays. Because, as you know, it's a little bit difficult to just hand someone a 2,000-page book and be like, here you go, change your life, you'll love it. 2,000 pages, someone's like, are you kidding me?
And the beginning was a little hard to read. And you know what? I'm going to be really public. I read it on psilocybin mushrooms.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that, whoa, I felt like this light coming into my heart. And I felt like this rings true in my heart. Yeah. And that might not be everybody's path, but that I felt like I was able to grok, which is now in the dictionary, or really grasp the concepts in there. And again, like I said, I'm another faction of the book, but I do get to talk about it a lot. And I think there's a lot of people that buy the book because I talk about it, I
agree. It's true. I mean, I have the privilege of seeing when there's sales and when there isn't. So I know usually I always check after somebody does some kind of presentation and stuff just to see if there's a spike in sales and stuff like that. And that's why I appreciate you and having you on, because you're taking one of the paths that is engaging youth and others into seeing the value of this revelation, and that they can adopt it now, that it's not like, wait on the Lord and he will return for you and bring you back into the promised lands of milk and honey. It's like, look, the milk and honey's right here, right now. Go ahead, go for it, be healthy. So I appreciate that there's people like you who have their skill set and they've practically applied it in real life service. And I encourage more to be like that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Derek.
So with that note, I'd like to say, thank you for joining us, and thank you guys for joining us at the Spirit of Truth video podcast. We're going to have plenty of more. Stick around. Please like, share, subscribe, donate. Don't be embarrassed to share with your friends.
Peace and love.
So thanks again.